last talk I discussed the composition of watercolours and how most of the paint's properties are derived from the physical nature of the pigments used. Let us now look at how to assess and test the watercolour. But before we can do that, we must first define what properties are important. There is a lot of information out there in magazines and on the internet that describe the properties of watercolours that are highly prized by watercolourists. These are transparency and opacity, permanence or light fastness, granulation, staining and non-staining. I am intrigued that this list of properties follows the information that is generally found on each watercolour label or in the manufacturer's marketing information, and doesn't include what I would consider the most important properties a watercolour must have: purity of colour and its intensity or brightness. My own list of properties extends the list further to 10 properties: transparency and opacity, permanence or light fastness, granulation, staining and non-staining, purity of colour, colour intensity or brightness, tinctorial strength, wet to dry colour shift, resolubility, wet in wet flow. Now we have our list of properties to assess. How do we prepare our test piece, which should not vary in film thickness but be the same every time? In general, it is difficult to reproduce the exact film weight when painting or brushing out watercolour. Dilution may also be difficult to control, as the brush will almost certainly contain additional water after it has been cleaned between painting out the watercolours on test. Therefore, it is normal to prepare test pieces by painting each watercolour out using a graduated wash. In so doing, it makes it easier to compare samples at similar film weights by moving the wash of the test sample up and down the one it's being compared to. Test 1. Transparency and opacity. By painting a colour over a dark background will determine if a watercolour is transparent, semi-transparent or opaque. Assessment should only be made after the colour has dried. Painting over a pencil or ink line may interfere with the lay of the colour over the line, so I use black card in order to avoid a false result. Test 2. Permanence or light fastness. Watercolours should be labelled with the pigment number to show which pigments they are made with. If there is just one pigment number, they are a single pigment colour. If there are two or more, they are made from mixed pigments. The pigment numbers are a form of classification of the chemistry by the Society of Dyers and Colourists. These pigment numbers form the colour index, which not only gives the chemical composition but also commercial names and manufacturers. In terms of the colour index pigment numbers, light fastness test data and permanence can be simply obtained from a quick internet search. A simple to do light fastness test can be done by taking a graded wash of the colour to be tested. Cover one half and then place it in a position inside a window where it will receive the most direct sunlight. Leave it for several months, checking it every week by examining the uncovered part and compare it against the one that is covered. Note any difference. The light fast watercolour will show no change, either by darkening or lightening. Test 3. Granulation. On painting out, there are two ways a pigment granulates to give a mottled appearance. It either flocculates as the water evaporates, or if the pigment is heavy, it settles out in the dimples of the watercolour paper. By painting the watercolour out on smooth and rough paper will determine if it flocculates and by which mechanism. If you use only one type of paper, you will most likely only be concerned how the watercolour behaves on your paper. So just paint out a graduated wash and inspect it at different graduations. Test 4. Staining and non-staining. To check if a watercolour is staining or non-staining, the test is fairly simple. Paint out the colour and then, when it is dry, use a wet brush or a cloth or a tissue to lift out a portion of the painted colour. If the watercolour lifts out cleanly with no staining, then it is a non-staining colour. Again, if you use only one type of paper, you will most likely only be concerned how the watercolour behaves on your paper. So just paint out a graduated wash and inspect how the colour lifts out at the different graduations. Test 5. Purity of colour. The test piece is prepared by painting each watercolour out using a graduated wash. In so doing, it makes it easier to compare samples at similar film weights by moving the wash of the test sample up and down the one it's being compared to until the equivalent film weight can be seen. Purity of colour can be checked by eye. Test 6. Colour intensity or brightness. Colour intensity can be determined at the same time as purity of colour, except we are comparing brightness as we move the graduated wash of the test sample up and down the one it's being compared to. Test 7. Tinctorial Strength. This is very much a comparative test of watercolours with identical pigments, as subtle hue differences will make it very difficult to assess tinctorial strength. The test sample is diluted with a white gouache. The white should be kept standard and the same tube or pot used for each test. Add to the colour in the ratio of 1 part to 10 parts white. Mix it thoroughly and then allow to dry before making the comparison. Test 8. Wet to dry colour shift. Paint out the colour and then allow it to dry. Then, at the same dilution, paint the watercolour out again next to the dried film and make an immediate assessment of the colour between the two. Test 9. Resolubility. Place the watercolour on the palette and allow it to dry. Once dry, draw a wet brush over the colour 10 times and paint out the colour into a block. Note the strength of the colour of the painted film once it is dry. To compare against other watercolours, simply repeat the test as closely as possible and compare results. Test 10. Wet in wet flow. Wet an area of the watercolour paper in an approximate square. Slightly lift one edge of the paper and support it. In the centre of the wet patch, dab a brush loaded with watercolour and hold it there for 5 seconds. Lift the brush up and monitor the flow of the watercolour. An assessment of how far the colour has travelled can be made once the paper is dry. Professional and artist quality watercolours will perform differently to student grades, which in turn will behave differently to the ones primarily for education and children. Sometimes it is quite difficult to tell which is which from the labelling and packaging, or on painting them out. I recommend using these 10 tests to compare the performance between professional and student grade watercolour. The difference will be like chalk and cheese.